Good evening, everyone. My name's Phillip Bloom. I'm the curator of the Chinese Garden and the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies at the Huntington. Welcome to the 2022-2023 Center for East Asian Garden Studies lecture series. As you can see, we're still doing this online, simply because we've been able to reach a much larger audience than we ever have before with our in-person lectures. I hope in the future we'll be doing hybrid lectures, both in person at the Huntington with a live broadcast portion as well. But for the moment, we're on Zoom. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to Azby Brown's talk on learning from Edo, how traditional Japan's approach to sustainability can help show us the way forward. I just would like to briefly express my thanks to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund and the Japanese Gardens Programs Fund for sponsoring this evening's lecture. The lecture series is inaugurated this evening. We'll actually not continue it until January, on January 19th. Also a Thursday, Morgan Patelka from the University of North Carolina will be joining us, and we'll continue the series later in the spring. But for the proper introduction to this evening's speaker, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Robert Hori, the Garden's Cultural Curator and Programs Director. So Robert, take it away.
Thank you so much, Philip. As many of you know, we are moving an Edo-period house, a 320-year-old house from Marugame, Japan, to the Huntington. And we have about a year's more work to do on the house before it opens in fall of 2023. When I first visited the house in 2016, I walked into the house and somehow it seemed very familiar to me, as if I had been there before. And when I thought about where I might have seen a house like this, it was actually in the book that was published by our speaker today, Azby Brown. And he has a samurai house in there, and it had many, many similar characteristics, which helped me understand it. And throughout the course of the restoration of the house, and moving the house, Azby Brown's book on sustainability and Edo-period culture has been really a guiding light and helped us to shape how we think about this house. Azby Brown is a native of New Orleans and has lived in Japan since 1985. He is the leading authority on Japanese architecture, design, and environmentalism, and the author of many influential books and articles, including The Very Small House in 205, Just Enough, Lessons in Living Green from Traditional Japan 2010, and The Genius of Japanese Carpentry in 2014. And I'm very happy that Just Enough is now again in publication and has been re-released this spring. He majored in fine arts and architecture at Yale University, graduating in 1980. In 1985, he was named a National Foreign Scholar by the Japanese Ministry of Education, which supported his graduate studies in architecture at the University of Tokyo. He joined the Faculty of Architecture at the Kanazawa Institute of Technology in 1995. In 2003, Azby founded the KIT Future Design Institute, focusing on cognitive and cultural issues surrounding the human hand and its use in the creative process, and conducting collaborative research with neuroscientists and perceptual psychologists. His creative work has been widely exhibited at galleries and museums internationally. So I'm very grateful for Azby for joining us from Japan today to talk about Edo-period sustainability and what we might learn from it. Azby, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert, for the kind introduction, and thanks, Philip, and thanks to everyone else at the Huntington for inviting me. And I have to say, I was really touched. It was very gratifying to hear that my writings about Edo-period in some way influenced your project to move and restore the Shoya, as a sustainable example. That was really, really interesting to me, and I'm glad to be able to talk a little more about those issues. So yeah, I have some images to share, and I will just go ahead and be showing those as I'm talking. We'll be taking questions. There'll be a lot of time to talk later, I think, and I look forward to hearing your responses and hearing more about the things that interest all of you. So I will share the screen now. Wait one moment. This always takes a moment to organize this. No matter how much we get used to these systems, there's always something. So let's go again. Okay, I hope you can all see the title slide, Learning from Edo, How Traditional Japan's Approach to Sustainability Can Help Show Us the Way Forward. Just as way of a self-introduction, I mean, Robert mentioned some in the introduction. I'm from New Orleans, and growing up in New Orleans shaped me in some important ways, I think. As many of you have probably been there, it's an old city. It didn't realize what it had in terms of cultural resources until into the 20th century, when people realized that there was a lot of old buildings or old neighborhoods that were intact in a way that was very, very unusual for the United States. So growing up in New Orleans meant growing up in an environment that had aged, and often aged very gracefully and beautifully, and often in ways I later realized that really sort of fit the Japanese notion of wabi-sabi, that we tend to kind of like things that are a bit worn and tattered and show their age and show the effects of time. It's also a very, very green city, verdant city. In typical neighborhoods, of course, there are some wonderful grand homes and grand neighborhoods, but the city as it was built for workers, for instance, in the 19th century, the houses then were actually quite dignified, even for people who were of working class. And of course, there was lots of problems throughout the history of the South regarding slavery, regarding other inequalities, and we're living with those legacies. But New Orleans still had something very, very special, I realized. Part of it is the social connections, this importance of, communication and bonding as neighborhoods, neighborhood identities. People from New Orleans loved their city. And I was a bit surprised when I went to college to realize that wasn't always the case. So we're really proud of it. We want to protect it. And this is something that's become important to me in my work as we've gone on. And of course, the city and the state of Louisiana are very environmentally vulnerable. As we know, Hurricane Katrina demonstrated that, and dealing with, climate change and rising ocean, et cetera, is a real challenge. I got to college and, expected to study theater because I did a lot of theater and performing arts in high school. But I was drawn to fine art and architecture, largely because I took introductory courses with some really outstanding professors. And after a year or so, I discovered Japanese carpentry through books. And this is an illustration from a very important book, one of the first ones published in English about this by Kiyoshi Seki, called The Art of Japanese Joinery. And I would just look at these and think, my goodness, this is fabulous. I really would like to see this in person. And it was a bit of a dream for me. I didn't know that I would be able to do it, but was able to make a brief trip to Japan a few years after graduating, and then able to go back in 1985 with a grant to study and to research, specifically to research what's called miyadaiku, which is temple carpentry. And this is a photograph of Tsunekazu Nishioka, who is considered the last great miyadaiku, who passed away in 1995. And I was very fortunate to spend several years researching at his building site at the temple of Yakushiji. And this is a photo of Yakushiji. His family had been the hereditary carpenters of Hori Temple, which many of you probably know is considered the oldest wooden building in the world, again, built in basically the 600s. And Yakushiji is just a little bit more recent. And on the far left of this photo you can see a pagoda. It's the eastern pagoda of the temple. This is original and largely intact from the original construction. And Nishioka's project was to restore the rest of the temple, including the golden hall in the center. And on the far right is a pagoda replica of what was originally there. And this is a project that took decades and occupied him for decades. And I initially thought I wanted to be trained as a Japanese carpenter, but I was already in my late 20s, and I had my own creative ideas. I had the own things I wanted to do, and I realized that, perhaps temperamentally, I wasn't really cut out for 7 or 8 years of just pure obedience. And so I asked him instead if I could document his progress, his project. And he said yes. And it was very, very generous offer. So I spent about 3 years documenting the construction of a particular building in this complex. And that became the book, The Genius of Japanese Carpentry. This is a photo of me at the time. I look young. I have hair underneath the helmet, but it was great to actually spend time absorbing not just the details of how things are assembled, but also the atmosphere and the thinking and even the values. And ultimately, the values are most important. And one of the things that I absorbed from Master Nishioka was the importance of environment. Because I would ask him questions, and if I had been an actual apprentice, a deshi, I would not have been allowed to ask questions, but I would be able to make an appointment with him and then have a list of questions to ask. So, Master, why do you do things this way? You leave this gap at this area of the construction when it's finished. Why is that? And he would talk about how the wood is going to continue changing, and speaking of wood as a living thing. And of course, for a Western carpenter, and I had learned in the sculpture department, I was teaching myself joinery. For us, a good carpenter is making things where the dimensions are all correct and the finish is nice and things fit together well. But for a Japanese carpenter, that is the least of it. To be a good Japanese carpenter, you have to understand wood as a living thing. And as Master Nishioka would explain often, the environment that the wood grew in will affect it throughout its entire living life, and then its use within a building. And you need to understand how the wind, the moisture, the sun affected that tree, and be able to then predict based on that through your understanding and experience how that wood is going to change once it's used in the building over time. So this was remarkable to me. And of course, he thinks, and they are accustomed to thinking in terms of 1,000-year time spans. That a tree is 1,000 years old when they cut it to be used in the building. And then if it's built correctly, it can last 1,000 years or more. So this was fairly mind-blowing for me, and that affected me. And as I got opportunities to speak to and learn from other Japanese craftspeople, whether it's lacquer or paper making or almost any craft, they all had a similar sensibility. They all were very conscious of the environmental aspects that shape their work. And so I felt that there was this great body of knowledge there. And so that sort of led me to, after writing other books, after writing the carpentry book, which actually first came out in, I want to say 1988, and then was, reissued and finally reissued again in a revised version in 2014, and other books about more contemporary aspects of architecture, such as compact housing. I revisited the issue of Edo period because there seemed to be a lot of wisdom still in circulation as anecdotes among people about how the Edo period population used their resources very wisely without waste, etc. And when I wrote the book, titled Just Enough, that was like 2010 when it came out, 2009, 2010. There was a lot of interest in sustainability, but the concept of circularity, circular economy, had not really coalesced. And in the intervening years, it has. So I think maybe some of the audience may not be that familiar with what we mean by circularity. But what my main point to make in today's talk is that Edo period practices for the environment really are a prototype and a model for developing a circular society. So circularity, comes from, it's looking for an alternative to what is our current way of economic and material production, which we characterize as take, make, dispose. And, that means you get the resources, you manufacture something, and then when it's done with, when you finish using it, then you dispose of it, either incineration or landfill or maybe some other way. And of course, this has been terrible for the environment for a lot of reasons over the course since the Industrial Revolution, and certainly since the 20th century. And what the circular economy seeks to do is sort of turn this into a repeating circle. It still has some of the same elements. So the take part is this collection of resources, and circular thinkers try to focus on what we call biological inputs. This means things like trees, wood, certainly food, certainly, let's say, natural fibers for clothing, et cetera. So there's a lot of biological inputs, which are sort of inherently renewable or could be. And then, of course, non-renewable inputs, you're going to need to use metals and other things. So these are probably non-renewable, but you should find a way to reuse them. We hope that the process is powered by renewable energy as well. And again, hopefully low carbon or zero carbon energy, because this is one of the greatest challenges facing us now is the carbon in the atmosphere. Then we have the manufacturing, the make phase. And circular thinking strives to, again, minimize energy use to minimize waste in the manufacturing phase. And a lot of manufacturers in the world, and certainly in Japan, have sort of gotten onto this bandwagon and are trying to do that. We have to address the use of energy and resources and effects on the environment in the distribution phase, transporting things, all the trucks, all the ships, all of that stuff, the packaging, et cetera. We have to think about that. Then we have the use phase, which is, of course, we're using our tables, our phones, our cars, we're eating the food. So we will continue to use things, and then hopefully are able to upcycle as much as possible after the use phase. And upcycling is sort of just a modification of recycling to indicate that hopefully we can bring those items back to the top of this entire production cycle, rather than just destroying it or landfilling it or incinerating it, to have these things coming back into the cycle and to try to design products, et cetera, that we use that make this easy to do. And to do this in a way that regenerates natural capital. So this is the big problem, is that most of our use of natural resources, such as timber or our agriculture or our fishing, it doesn't regenerate the living beings, in an adequate way. Generally, it actually damages their ability to reproduce and to grow and to flourish. So we need to think about regenerating all of this natural capital. And of course, we want to minimize waste at the use phase and every other phase. It's never probably going to be possible to totally eliminate it, but we want to squeeze it down to be as little as possible. Other aspects have to do with prolonging the useful life of the things that we are using. For instance, reuse and repair. Even we can do that on our own. Just don't trash the blender when it breaks. Try to get it fixed, right? And to reuse it, to redistribute things. And a lot of us do this anyway. For instance, sending old clothes to the clothing recycle shop, et cetera, or even old furniture. We're doing that, but redistribution as a more conscious way to put things back into the use cycle. And then reconditioning, which again, we already do to some degree. A lot of used cars are reconditioned, appliances are being reconditioned. Of course, fortunately, many manufacturers are designing things. They've been encouraged to design things, in some cases, particularly in Europe, mandated by law to design things so they can be easily disassembled into component parts and parts replaced, and the things can be reconditioned and brought back into that cycle. And this kind of thinking, this kind of process is what we call circularity. And it really started to coalesce, I would say, about 10 years ago. And some very important reports, like from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others, and that brought together several streams of thought that had already been circulating and just really brought together into a coherent body. And so basically what it seeks to do is to maximize use and minimize waste. And some of the key ways to do that are dematerialization, reduce the resources that are used in them if possible. Modularity, modular design, make things that can be upgraded and repaired easily. Extending the product life, make them that last, that can be repaired, that can be refurbished, and moving from products to services as much as possible. It's not necessary to own everything. It's possible to share, to rent a lot of things that we use. And what I realized or found, or have been trying to help people understand for a long time, is that the Edo-period system, and we'll call it a system, although it was never designed from the top down. It emerged through how people were living in their own innovative thinking over the centuries. This is basically what it accomplished. It basically accomplished almost everything that circular thinking asks us to do. The Edo period, many of you know, began in the early 1600s and lasted until the Meiji Restoration, which opened up the country and began this modernization in 1868. And I love this ukiyo-e, a woodblock print by Hokusai, which is viewing the sunset over the Ryogoku Bridge from the Onmaya embankment. This is the Sumida River. This geology, this landscape is changed in terms of what people have built, but the river's still there, Mount Fuji's still there. It's still the same environment in a lot of ways. And I like the life of the people that this, displays as well. So for us, we have a lot of pressing issues, and they've been sort of bearing down on us for decades. Global warming is, of course, a big one. Deforestation in many parts of the world. We're outstripping our, fresh water supplies in many parts of the world. We have lots of issues with energy production, particularly, again, carbon. We seem to continually need more energy, but sources like nuclear power, we understand they have huge flaws. When they go bad very big and fast, as we learned from Fukushima. Population issues, population growth, and particularly urbanization is an issue. Food supply, how we're going to feed everybody. There are still parts of the world where there's not enough food. What do we do with all the waste we generate? We tend to we've been shipping stuff from the US to China for decades, and now the Chinese don't want our waste anymore. And, what are we going to do with that? And finally, do we have the information and feedback that we need in order to know what's going on and where we need to devote our resources and our attention? Interestingly, Edo-period Japan had most of the same challenges, except for climate change. They had a large population, 30 million people, which is similar to the population of, say, Poland now. So this is a large country, a large population, and 90% of them were rural people. A very limited land for farming, basically very mountainous country. Farms have to be built in valleys, and basically they sort of ran out of space to use for farming pretty much in the 18th century. So this is a big issue. Limited resources in general, not a lot of metal ores, not a lot of other things, but they have a good climate and very literate society, even then, much more literate than Europe or North America at the time. Many more people could read and write and do mathematics. Well-organized society, and they have a strong anti-waste ethic, and all these things really helped the nation, deal with its resource issues. So, in our current society and education and way of thinking and doing things, we think of things like water and forest, energy, waste, food as sort of separate things. You can study forestry, for instance, and probably never really need to learn anything about energy production, or you can study, water issues and never really need to learn anything about waste. But in fact, these are all connected. And I think the Japanese people of the period understood that very well, not in a scientific or statistical way that we might, but empirically through centuries of experience and learning and trying to maximize their ability to use what they have. And I think of these things as vectors, like if you think of a vector connecting water and energy, well, anytime you make or use hot water, you are involving both the water supply and the energy supply. So something you can do to, do that better, more efficiently, less wastefully, is going to probably improve both of those as resources. And there are vectors connecting pretty much everything, everywhere you look. And that was an interesting thing for me as I was writing the book, just enough, was to look at where things connect up. And I couldn't have written the book without all of the specialists who had gone before me, researching, Edo-period societies, environment, economies, etc. And they were all generally very specialized. Someone who specializes in samurai economy, or someone who specializes in forestry, or someone who specializes in, river, issues of the period. They all tended to specialize, and very few of them were looking at the big picture. But if you understand, like I think people of the Edo period did, that these things are connected and that there are ways to make use of those connections that in a way that strengthens the whole and, minimizes the damage. That's very, very good. But if you don't, you end up with these catastrophic interactions, basically dominoes. For instance, deforestation, can somehow lead to river problems, which then leads to agricultural problems, which then leads to other problems. And how can we change this catastrophic interaction into a virtuous cycle is always the question. It's the same relationships. And if you tug over here, it's going to affect something over there. Well, then how do you know if you shape or protect this, it will also protect that? So this is a thinking that we need, which I believe people of the Edo period understood very, very well. And I think about one of the most important aspects is something I call multi-form solutions. We have the, saying to kill two birds with one stone. And I think people of the Edo period were regularly killing like 5 or 10 with one stone, finding one design or one intervention or one way of doing things that actually has beneficial effects in several areas at the same time. And I think I will be able to show you a lot of examples of that today. Another thing is that it requires what we call systems thinking. And systems thinking is now a bit of a buzzword, and it certainly relates to engineering and almost everything else that we're doing in our economic and productive life. But I think, again, the Japanese understood these as systems, even if they didn't necessarily have that specific vocabulary for it. These are all interacting, fairly dynamic, fairly complex systems, which you can still grasp in poetic or conceptual ways or through action. And I think that is what they did. There are some really important cultural values as well, especially ethical values, that made it easier for Japanese society to do what it needed to do to, restore their environment and to generate a constantly increasing quality of life for most people, while making good use of these limited resources. This is a drawing of a very famous stone water basin at Ryo-Anji Temple in Kyoto, and it has an inscription around it. And this is kind of a visual pun. Each of the 4 characters, top, bottom, right, and left, use the square character, which is for mouth. And so it's sort of a visual pun or sort of an anagram. And this can be translated in many different ways, but basically the common way is ware tada taru shiru, which basically can be translated as all I need is enough. I only need to know what enough is. I only care about having enough. And this is where the title of my book came from, this idea of what is sufficient and what is trying to grasp or consume or to have ambitions beyond your station. And this is a Zen temple. This is a Zen saying. It's a Zen phrase. It sort of encapsulates this notion that we should strive in life really to have enough and not to be possessive and not to be allow ourselves to be tied down by things or by our aspirations for material goods in particular, or even power or influence in life. So this is one thing. And this sort of thinking pervaded Japanese culture, I believe, for several centuries, and is reflected in other sayings, and other attitudes that emerge. It is also similar. It sort of dovetails nicely with Shinto thinking, which perhaps many of you know is the indigenous religion of Japan. It predates the introduction of Buddhism in the 5th century AD. And it's animistic. So that means that mountains and trees and rivers and the sky and the sun are all divinities, and that they exist in harmony. But that humans can sort of damage or break that harmony and break that balance. So a lot of Shinto is about restoring balance through purification. And basically, one of the main lessons that we get from it is that humans are not the most important thing in this entire creation. We have a place, we have a role, and the nature will support us. It can be a very beautiful thing to live that way, but it's also possible for humans to destroy the balance and to have a difficult time restoring it. So all of these sort of, to me, they dovetail very, very nicely about the place of humans. And as I get into this, I'll be talking a bit about like farmers and people in rural areas, forests, et cetera, and also about the urban population. And, they had somewhat distinct lifestyles, but in terms of material culture, they were very, very similar. They were basically building in similar ways, they were consuming similar things, they were making similar things, and so lots of shared features. But it's very interesting to see, how was the life of fishermen different from the life of farmers, for instance? But of course, there were fishermen who did farming as well. How is the life of commoners different from samurai in the cities, or how monks lived? So this is very, very interesting. But I like to stress the commonalities, that they really are all of a piece in terms of what we're discussing. I mentioned Japan didn't have a lot of arable land. It's very mountainous, very forested. This is a typical agricultural valley. And even if you go now, it looks fairly similar. In the period before the Edo period began, there had been a few centuries of war, civil war, which led to great environmental depredation, including mass deforestation. And I alluded earlier to, what can happen, this sort of cascade of bad effects, this domino effect when this happens. And we've seen this in many parts of the world over time. And some areas have never recovered from deforestation. But, the trees are cut down, and if they're not replanted, then, you get, landslides, and rivers get silted up, and that, destroys the fish stocks, or it can lead to unpredictable flooding, which can lead to damaging of the agricultural land, which can lead to famine, and a lot of other, terrible things. And what the Edo period society, and due to actually wise leadership on this point, did was they restored the forests. They focused on restoring the forest first. They realized that was the center. And if that was restored, then it would be much easier to manage everything else and to restore everything else. And so they introduced what we would call regenerative forestry. One of the first clear examples, systematic examples of that. It took time. It took decades, the better part of a century, but it worked. And the first step was to gather and share information about the health of the environment. So this information is always key. And I mentioned that, Edo-period Japan were very literate people. Certainly the samurai were very well educated. Most merchants were pretty well educated. And even a lot of farmers, what we consider peasants, many of them were also literate, maybe as much as 40%. And the wonderful thing is, the publishing industry was fabulous. I showed an example of an ukiyo-e woodblock print for the books. If you've seen them, they're beautiful. They're published, basically through woodblock printing with often fabulous illustrations. And there were manuals and how-to guides to do just about everything. So what the central government did, the shoguns, they sort of decreed that the forests needed to be, the trees needed to be counted. And they instituted a tree census. And that means sending out teams, like there's probably a few samurai there and some local people, checking the forest to see if it's healthy, to see what the tree stocks are, to see if it's a forest that needs to be left alone for a long time, for instance, if there are some particularly fine trees that the government may want to reserve for its own use for building a major structure, et cetera. So this was a process that took decades, but it was the central effort in restoring the environment and pulling back from this impending catastrophe. So in this, citizens played an important role. And citizens, of course, it's a caste society. It's a pyramid with the warrior caste, the samurai at the top, with the shoguns at the very top of that, and then the lords, the daimyo, and then the other ranks of samurai. The next in status were the farmers, which seems a bit counterintuitive to us, but it was because they were considered to be living a virtuous and productive life that benefits everyone. So they were the next in status, and below them were craftspeople, again, because they're producing things that people need. And the lowest were the merchants, because basically they're interested in money, and money was considered kind of evil. And so they were considered the least virtuous. And this was always a sort of internal tension in society. But citizens throughout society were playing a role to help monitor the environment and to make sure it was used ethically. And one example that struck me is, the sort of processes and, let's say, institutions that they developed to monitor forests from when they're planted until they're ready to be harvested, which is about 50 years. They generally planted in species like sugi cedar and hinoki cypress and some akamatsu pines that were very, very useful in timber. And I will mention as an aside, these did tend to be monocultures, and this meant replacing, in many cases, originally mixed forests with these monocultures of evergreens. And we understand now that that led to some other unfortunate effects, but basically they reforested things. And so if the tree is planted, on the far left is when the tree is planted, the new regulations were that if you cut down a tree, you had to replace it. You had to plant another one. But of course, if you plant seedlings, they don't all survive. So you probably have to plant 5 and then gradually thin them out to keep the healthiest specimens. So if I was, say, 20 years old when this is happening, I'm participating in this planting. Maybe I have a son who's just born then. As we go through it, the first stages of care, let's say 10 years later, I'm 30, my son is like 10, and he can probably come along and participate. When I'm 40, let's say my son is 20, and then I have a grandson. So my son is now sort of taking over this monitoring, and this means they have to cut the branches and they have to continue to thin the things out and get rid of the trees that are unhealthy. And this goes on. A few years later, a decade later, the son is 40, the grandson's 20, and now it's into the third generation of family that has been monitoring and taking care and taking responsibility for this forest. And then finally, it gets cut. So I'm 50 years old, and Japanese at this period, many didn't live much beyond 50. 50 was old. So I probably was not able to do a lot of physical labor, but maybe there in sort of a supervisory capacity. So, and this is happening throughout society in every region, having these systems where local people are encouraged to participate in monitoring and taking care of the forest. And of course, forests were often commercial ventures. So sometimes there was a payment for this. Other times they would simply be allowed to gather wood for their own use, etc. So for forestry, just kind of a summary, this depredation, this deforestation crisis began in the 16th century before the Edo-period started. The solution was regenerative forestry. They began the census in earnest in 1644, and after a few decades, it was complete. And this involved, some of the conclusions they made was to close certain forests and to limit, if not ban, clear cutting. And this really is what helped. It was plantation forestry with specialization in terms of species. They improved the transportation to make it possible to do it in ways that didn't damage the forest while they're getting the logs out. And they established institutions for this long-term monitoring that I just described. And also, there's a lot of other things that were done to conserve forest resources, which include building design and regulations to use less wood, constantly evolving to use less wood and to use wood structurally in a more efficient manner. So, this is again this typical farming valley at the bottom of the valley, which was originally probably a forest or a natural wetland. This is where the rice paddies are, and maybe some other fields in certain seasons. And the farmsteads themselves are usually around the periphery and sort of the base of the hillsides. There's a lot of regional variation and change over time, but this is a very typical sort of pattern. And other kind of farm fields on these lower hillsides and orchards, etc. But one of the key aspects for subsistence and this developing this relationship to the environment is understanding is what's called the satoyama, which you can sort of translate as the village mountain. So the mountains surrounding the hillsides surrounding the villages were used jointly as a joint resource for fuel, mainly wood, for foraging food, mushrooms and warabi ferns and lots of wild plants and things that grew. They were jointly used and jointly managed, and so they developed into what we would call a managed forest. And this relationship to the satoyama was crucial for the life of the village. And people depended on it for their daily life. And now, interestingly, recent decades, there's been a sort of revival of interest in what that was and what Satoyama is. And you can go to different parts of Japan and have like Satoyama workshops and experiences. But the fact is, the people depended on it for life at the time, and now we don't. We can learn about it, but it's not the same sort of thing. An example of ways that they used forest to, in a way that preserved it, to use their Satoyama, regards gathering fuel. And basically, people were forbidden from cutting trees to use them for fuel. If a tree was blown down by a typhoon, you could probably get permission to cut it up to use it for firewood, but otherwise you had to only gather what had fallen on the ground. And this imposes a natural limit. I mean, the forest, in that sense, has a natural carrying capacity, a certain amount of use of this wood that it can support. And the population has been living here for generations, perhaps centuries, and they know what this is year to year. They understand in some years it'll be more, in some years it'll be less, but they have a good idea. So people have to go in there, pick up what has fallen on the ground naturally, cut it up, and carry it out on their backs. Like they generally were not allowed to use a wagon, an ox cart or something to carry out more. So all of these things sort of, put limits on how much can be taken out of the forest by any person, by any household. And this worked very, very well. Other aspects, charcoal was also a very important source of fuel, more for the urban areas. And so the production of charcoal also was done in a sustainable way. There's something called coppices, which is species of trees, many species of oaks, for instance, that grow from the same rootstock, many trunks growing from the same root. To make charcoal, it only needs to be about, for maybe less than 8 inches in diameter. And that grows in a few years. Then you can cut the trees on that coppice and make charcoal from that, and let that coppice regrow. And after, 10 years or so, it's ready to be used again. So this is a fairly renewable way to provide fuel without damaging the forest. Something that I think we really, really need to learn from, at least in concept. Not that we need to go back to, using wood, but to try to think about how our use of energy can be done in a way that protects the environment rather than damages it. And another sort of, let's say, offshoot of this approach towards fuel has to do with what's called the kamado cook stove. They were made of clay. They can be very, very beautiful. They usually have more than one firebox. This one has two, one big one, one slightly smaller one. And that means that depending on how much you need to cook and how much fuel it's going to take, you can choose that. It's like having the heat control on your range. And some of them have as many as 6 or 8 fireboxes, real showy things, but it can burn everything. It can burn wood, of course, but it can burn, straw, even, old sandals. It can burn, old clothes. Anything can be burned here and used as fuel. And the design is they're remarkable examples of modular design, which again is one aspect of circular design, that, the main pots have a lip which seals tightly over the hole over the firebox so that the heat doesn't escape. And then there's lots of attachments and other things that you can put on top of that for like steaming buns, etc. And this is a very, very interesting design, and it's fairly ubiquitous and fairly easy to make. And then things like the ash is kept, the embers are kept, the ash is kept. These things are preserved because the ash has other uses, some things I may talk about in a moment. So the way to use the fuel, the way to gather the fuel are all designed to preserve the forest. And that to me is a remarkable lesson. So in terms of energy, of course, most of the farmsteads, most of these things, the buildings, they're using solar energy and minimizing the use of other heat sources. Maybe small hibachis next to where people are sitting, hibachi stove, which can burn charcoal, for instance. They don't use a lot of energy. Charcoal is economized at every stage in the kitchen. This kamado stove was one example, but also, especially in the cities, there was a lot of commercial food preparation where, a business person could cook a lot of steamed buns, for instance, and economize on the use of fuel to do that. And you could simply go buy the finished product. And this was very, very important. And also food cooked or preserved or used in ways that don't require energy or cooking, the pickling, the drying. There's a lot of ways to do it. Even sashimi or sushi are an example of being able to, eat something without using cooking or using fuel. So if we get to talking about a farmstead, again, there's a lot of variation, but a typical one I mentioned is on the hillside. Here we have at the bottom rice paddies. I wonder if you can see my cursor. Maybe you can. Rice paddies. There's an irrigation system, and these were beautifully designed and often predated the roads and every other infrastructure. The farmstead usually has a main house. It's often called an omoya. Lots of local terminology for this. This is where people live. It's also a workspace, some outbuildings, sheds, storage buildings, etc. Usually a sort of kitchen garden and a pond, which is important because there's a lot of things that need water that don't need water that's of a drinkable quality. So, used for various work and other things around the farm, the ponds are done. Now, the planting of trees was carefully thought out as well. Certain trees, tall trees, to use as windbreaks, especially for the winter months, and then other trees that are like nuts and fruit that also provide food there on the farmstead. And often they would have or encouraged to grow a bamboo grove, because bamboo is very, very useful for just about everything on the farm and elsewhere. And then it's very, very close and it's accessible to the Satoyama. So you can just go right from your farmhouse, up a path to the Satoyama. So farm buildings, again, there is variation, but they have some fairly common characteristics. One of them is that they have an earthen floored area called a doma. It's basically pounded clay mixed with lime. It gets very, very hard, almost like concrete. This is a work area. And a lot of things go on there. Farm jobs, farm work goes on there. Usually a large wooden floored area. Called a hiroma. There's other names for it as well, but a hiroma is a typical name. It probably has an irori, a fire pit, a hearth, where people can sit around and drink tea, maybe cook some food items as well. That's like the communication center. People sit there and they also do work. Like if they're going to do weaving or making sandals or things, that's probably where they're going to do it. And then some other rooms. There's a kitchen. Usually has a sink made of wood, and there's a sleeping room. And if it's a more prosperous farmer, they have a room called the zashiki, which I'll talk about in the samurai context later. But and initially, they didn't have tatami mats. Most farmers didn't. But over the course of centuries, tatami mats became more accessible to even farmers, etc. And the buildings, the lower structure, these farmhouses are now, there's kind of a boom and interest in them. They're called minka, which is like folk house. It's kind of a recent term, or ko-minka, which means old folk house. And there's a boom. And I've been to some wonderful events with people who are interested in restoring these things. And it's kind of similar to what you're doing with the shoya there at the museum. But the main structure is kind of difficult and requires like carpenters, real specialized carpenters to do. But the upper roof structure is basically poles that are lashed together in bamboo, that's lashed together in thatch. So this is stuff that doesn't require specialized labor. A lot of people can participate in that. And again, lots of structural techniques are going into something like a farmhouse, and they are generally similar to what's going into a temple building or a government building or a samurai house or a shop house in the city. The same kinds of joinery, the same kinds of techniques, although for farmhouses, one of the charms is that they're usually fairly rough and rustic and robust. Whereas if you're building a fine tea house, it'll be similar joints, but very finely done and very finely finished. It's wonderful to look at these, and there's a lot of craftspeople who know how to restore these things now. And this has changed and improved over the last few decades. A lot of things that happened on the farm and thatching the roof, rethatching the roof as an example, required something called yui, or depended on mutual assistance, which is, one family is not going to be able to rethatch their roof all by themselves, probably. So this was coordinated in the village as this cooperative aspect. And a lot of things were done cooperatively. Certain fields were held cooperatively. There was cooperative, mutual assistance for emergency funds, etc. So for rethatching, pretty much everybody in the village can participate. Or at least the surrounding several families would participate. Elderly people have a role, even kids can help out. And again, there's an important role for skilled people, and there's things that just the average person can do as well. And one thing that I found interesting was for thatching, they use this sort of big needle made of wood or bamboo to thread the rope through to tie the thatch down to the little structure underneath. And typically the man would be on the top pushing this needle in, and women would be on the bottom pulling the needle down. And this was for me, kind of poetic in a way about relations between men and women. Of course, this is not just a caste society. It's a very gendered society. A lot of us probably would not want to live in it, and it certainly doesn't fit many of our ideals about human rights in many respects. But this was interesting, almost kind of a sexual metaphor going on there. And then there's the final work, the final jobs, the finishing, the trimming and the tamping. This is going to be more specialized. So, farms in general, they were masterpieces of sustainable design. And as we get into talking about buildings in general more in a moment, you'll see a bit more why that's the case. And they used very little livestock. They had sophisticated irrigation systems, and their fuel needs were gathered by fallen wood. So we get to the present. Again, if we think about our water issues, and I'm thinking about the time, I'm a little concerned. I'm going to go over time. We're using too much of our supply of fresh water. We have high energy costs to move it, to pump it, to purify it. We pollute it in almost every way we use it. We use a lot of it. 70% of our freshwater use is for irrigation in the home. Half of it's used for just the shower and the toilet. It goes down the drain, so this is an issue. The Japanese had, I think, a much wiser approaches to this, and this is in drawing, sort of showing the overall, irrigation approach for rice paddies, and mainly it starts with the snowpack on the top of the mountain, which is like a big water tank. And as the climate changes and we're losing glaciers and this is going to be an ongoing issue, basically the irrigation systems depended on using the natural rivers and natural watershed as much as possible. So they would look at where the water was flowing naturally, where were the ponds that they could use as holding ponds, where they would store the water so they could open a little sluice gate to flood the fields when they need it. And then they would dig new channels where necessary. A typical rice paddy is terraced, and it's called dandan batake, so terraced rice paddy. And more recently, researchers have experimented and checked this out and have determined that the water that comes out at the end of this process, that goes back into the watershed, is cleaner, less polluted than the water that goes in, certainly in terms of organic matter, et cetera. And this is an example of a sort of principle, I think. It's very circular as well, a principle that I think we would benefit from trying to, implement in our own ways of using water. The water that comes out should be cleaner, should be better water than the water that goes in. And I think there are people who are doing this and trying to accomplish this as well. This image is, the text is Japanese, but it shows sort of a cross-section of a rice paddy. And I mentioned that the rice paddies generally replaced an original forest or wetland with what's in effect an artificial wetland, but that maintained a lot of the same environmental functions that a natural wetland would. They're wet part of the year, they're dry part of the year. When they're wet, the insects come, the animals that feed on insects, the frogs, etc. They come, birds, dragonflies, the birds eat the dragonflies, larger predator birds eat the smaller birds. And this is an entire ecosystem and habitat that this makes. And if you've ever been in Japan in the summer months, when the rice is getting high, the frog voices can be deafening. It's really a wonderful sort of, let's say, human reorganization of natural functions in the environment. I mentioned these vectors that connect things like water and energy. And there's something called gyozui, which we might translate as cat bath. And this is a process where you leave a big pot of water out in the sun, especially in the summer months, and it gets warm. And in the evening, it's warm enough to have a nice bath. You can wash yourself off here in the tub. It's not piping hot, but it's certainly warm enough. And then that water can then go back into the pond of the farm. You can use that water for making tea instead, for instance, and you don't need as much fuel to heat it. So this is one aspect of economizing energy related to water, making hot water. And the sento, the public bath, is another great example. And they're basically very similar to the public baths or the onsen now, where you go and you pay your money, you put your stuff in a locker. There's a changing room, but your entrance fee gets you one bucket of hot water for your personal use. You can use all the cold water you want. You can sit in the bathtub with other people, and that's a very economical way to get people clean. You can have hundreds of people, getting clean in the same tub in one day. If you did that at home, it would use like 10 times or more the amount of fuel. But the notion that you only get one bucket for your personal use, to me, was very, very striking. So this is economizing that hot water is kind of a semi-precious commodity, and economizing on that basically, helps with the energy supply as well. So used like a valuable resource. Oyu, of course, it's honorific. So is ocha, so is omizu, but oyu, I think, is a very honorific thing. And for heating, etc., I alluded to hibachi and other small stoves where you just sort of heat yourself. They wouldn't go and try to heat the whole house, and things like the ash that's left over is also valuable. For materials, there's a lot of ways, in our society, most of what we use is used one way. And I mentioned this, take, make, dispose. And our energy use is very, very inefficient in manufacturing and everything else. Raw materials, lots of them are in danger of running out, and high cost of disposal. Japanese society, pretty much across the board, had what we would consider a 100% full use of materials. And rice straw, what's called wara, is a good example. So, of course, rice is grown as food. And it grows on the rice plant, and they have the unhulled rice, and those hulls, it's called momi. Those are taken off. And they can be used for a lot of things, basically scrubbers or pillows or weights, lots of other things. Or you can just compost them if you want. And then you have the brown rice, the genmai, and it has this bran on it, which is called nuka. And that also can be used for things like pickles or skincare, et cetera. And that also can be compost. And ultimately you have the white rice, which was prized, especially for the cities, and was used for paying tax. But the straw was kind of remarkable. It's a byproduct of growing the rice for food, but it was used for everything. For making floor mats, shoes, aprons, bags, roof thatch, almost everything else. Of course, you could just right away compost it without using it for anything. So you're returning that, regenerating, the natural, resources that way. Or you could make something with it and then use it as fertilizer, or you could burn it and use it as fuel. And you can burn the shoes or the hats or whatever later as well. And that ash is high in potassium. Which is actually very useful for a lot of things, for dyes, for metal production, for ceramics, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why people would keep the ash and sell it. So this is this very, very circular approach towards using this as a byproduct. What is a byproduct? Again, something that we should try to learn from in principle. By and large, these things are just destroyed. And again, we talk about biological inputs, Japanese clothing, woven, maybe cotton, maybe flax, maybe silk. Japanese kimonos basically are woven as one long, thin rectangle of fabric, basically 12 meters. That's called one tan. And to make a kimono, basically you use rectangles. You're assembling the rectangles that you've cut from this big piece of cloth. It's very different from if we're cutting a shirt or a jacket or trousers where there's a lot of waste. There's basically no waste here. There's basically no waste. It's all used. This is kind of remarkable, and it's a wonderful garment. For instance, you can use a big one, and there's ways to easily adjust it to fit a kid. And this notion that this one kimono will be in use for a long time, and as we know, they can be used for generations, is true. Underwear, this is a men's fundoshi. This is called a rokushaku, very typical one, simple rectangle of cloth. When it's done, maybe you could, use it as a wash rag or something. Women's underwear was also a simple rectangle called a koshimaki, one size fits all. So all of these things were just using the fabric without waste. Which is, to me, another principle we should try to emulate. And in terms of this redistribution for circularity, there were estimated 500 used clothing sellers in Edo. There was no embarrassment of wearing or using, older clothes. People would trade it in and have something that's new for them. And this is constantly being redistributed and being refurbished. And speaking of that, there was probably over 1,000 recycling businesses, almost everything. Umbrellas, certainly things that are made of paper and wood, umbrellas and lanterns, but even pottery and everything else. So there was lots of recycling was done as a sort of a common thing. And reconditioning, again, is a very important circular thing. Yes, there were especially itinerant repairmen who would come around to the neighborhoods and would fix everything. Your shoes, the guy on the right is fixing wooden geta sandals, the guy in the center is fixing tobacco pipes, so this could be done. And in full sight of kids, who can learn about, how things are made. So for recycling, for waste, they were recycling pretty much everything. And, clothes, paper, wood, metal, umbrellas, building materials certainly were recycled. We'll touch on that in a moment. Everything from tatami, shoji, they recycle oil. The kitchen used cooking oil was recycled. Even barrels for sake and shoyu, those were recycled. And I mentioned they had itinerant, repairmen for everything. And now we'll get to talk about the city. And the image in the background is a beautiful Edozu Byobu from 17th century. The city of Edo, this is a map at the time, and I've color-coded. This is the water, including the bay, and then the Sumida River and natural rivers, and also the moats that were dug. And this would be farmland at the peak of Edo. It was actually pretty far close to the city. Most of what we call the Yamanore line, pretty much beyond that was farmland. There were temples and wooded areas, temples and shrines. A big one, Kaneji, which is now Ueno, and Zozoji Temple further down, which is still there. Edo Castle was at the center where the shoguns lived. And they were surrounded by daimyo, the powerful feudal lords. And also in yellow are the other ranks of samurai. So this is pretty much the high land, the hillier land, more desirable land. And the commoners, merchants and others, craftspeople, they had less desirable land, mainly reclaimed land. And they were pretty well crammed in there. And these were the main roads. They all radiated from Nihonbashi, which is the center of commoner life, including the Tokaido and the ones that went north in every other direction. Interestingly, the moat system was designed as a spiral, that this was a spiral city plan. It sort of intended initially that the city would expand in the spiral fashion, which is fairly unique in city planning in the world. So one key point is that, in terms of population, on the left, I'm showing that, there was only 200 daimyo, and 50% of the population were samurai, and a little bit less than 50% were commoners, and then you have the monks and priests and others. But in terms of land use, the daimyo had more than a third. The other samurai had more than a third, and the commoners were squeezed into less than 20%. So there's this huge disparity in how much land they had available to live on. It was a very water-oriented city. Lots of rivers, lots of canals. People used boats, etc., as taxis. Everything was transported. This is Nihonbashi, which was the heart of the merchant city. And the rest of the city was sort of laid out and planned around natural landmarks such as Atagoyama. So the streets would be facing a natural hill, a mountain, facing the ocean, facing Mount Fuji, facing other mountains in the distance. So this was something that was preserved until really the modern era, where the buildings got so big you couldn't see these things anymore. So for commoners, it was a fairly dense town, denser than the densest parts of Tokyo now. The residential areas were very efficient and modular in their layout, and there was really good services, things being delivered and things being taken away, and they managed to find rooms for gardens. And this is an example of the commoner neighborhood. They were where they could, like in the Kanda area, they were blocks about 120 meters square, and inside of these blocks were tenements called nagaya. So on the streets were these sort of nice, more substantial two-story shop buildings where the family lives in the back and on the second floor, but in the center were tenements, and a lot of, like 2/3 or more of the population lived in these tenements, and they were basically little communal housing developments, one-room apartments with a lot of shared features. And this is like a communal communal courtyard, which I'll touch on later, which has, a well and has the toilets and has a place to just throw your waste and a place to hang your laundry, maybe even a little shrine. And it's very close to each other, and there's not a lot of privacy. And people were living in like 6 mat rooms, 6 tatami mats, which is really not very big. And that means, the neighbors know everything that's going on, and everything that you're using has to be very modular and compact and able to be folded and put out of the way, which is, again, one of those aspects of Japanese design that we really prize even to this day. So again, I'm worried about the time. So, again, like here's the well, the woman's getting water from the well. There was a very well-developed water system, fresh water 24 hours a day. It wasn't really a well. It was more of a big water tank that was being fed from aquifers and from the aqueducts from the distant mountains. And this was at times when United States and Europe didn't have this kind of water system. Japanese cities almost always did. Toilets are a very interesting issue. And basically, farmers realized that human waste was a very, very useful fertilizer. So, and I was just hearing from Robert that for the shoya, they're planning to use this sort of toilet that can be cleaned out and somehow used perhaps for, maybe not for food, but for something else. And this led to this incredible economy where this waste was actually being bought and it was valuable, and an entire infrastructure for transporting it, et cetera. Someone would come and would clean out the toilet, and there were, standardized buckets for carrying it, and brokers, and transportation routes, and specialized boats, et cetera, and a ranking value depending on what kind of household it came from. And it was, we call it night soil, but it was a significant source of income. It didn't contaminate the water supply like when we developed, flush toilets. We just dumped it in the river. Before that, we had these festering cesspools, which were causing cholera and diseases. They didn't need to build a sewer system, so that saves on infrastructure costs, and there's great benefits for health and hygiene. So this is an example of killing many birds with one stone, which again, we would do well to learn from. And I would mention that house construction and placement of gardens maximized natural cooling. So the last thing I want to touch on, and then, I have more to talk about, but I think this is a good place to end, is what happened to a demolished building in the Edo period. Basically, everything was reused. There was a market for everything. The big beams and columns would instantly, there were specialized lumber yards that just dealt in that stuff, where if you wanted to build a shack or a shed or even a house, you could use that. Roof tiles, easily reusable. Everything made of metal, easily reusable. Metal, again, was kind of a scarce resource. So whether it's copper or iron, that was reusable. The sliding doors, the shoji, the fusuma, these things were basically standardized dimensions. You could take them off of one house and generally put it into another house just as it is. The same was the case for the tatami mats on the floor. Foundation stones were chosen because of their shape, and those could be reused as well. And you could crumble the walls, which are made of clay, into the ground or recycle some of that. And basically you could demolish the house and then the next day build a garden there. They didn't have cellars generally. So this was, again, a principle I think we should think about. The design was very good environmentally, low ecological footprint, use of natural sunlight, natural cooling, compact design, et cetera, and designed to be dismantled. So all of this aspect is basically something that's a very circular concept that is now getting a lot of attention, called buildings as material banks. So, basically it's not that the building is the finished, the end use of the material. You're simply keeping the materials in that building until you're going to use it somewhere else. And this is the way it was done for hundreds of years, or even 1,000 years in Japanese architecture. It's something I think we could learn from. Again, I guess this is a good place to stop. I would love to continue, but let's just go ahead and stop, and maybe it's time to take questions.
Great. Thank you for that wonderful talk, Azby. It was so comprehensive, and so compelling. You present the material in an amazingly accessible manner. So thank you so much. And you make a very, strong case for how, something, these 300-year-old ideas really are so relevant to the present. There are a couple of questions already. But maybe I'll just read one comment first. How can you ask a question to a lecturer who's so comprehensive, interesting, and you don't want him to stop? So that, I think, says it all right there. In any case, the first question is simply, what does Japan do with garbage that can't be recycled currently? Given that it's such a small island nation, how is trash treated today?
A lot of it ends up as landfill, and this is a problem. So if you've been to Japan, a lot of the islands off of Tokyo City in the Bay. This is landfill. And actually, the landfill began like in the 16th century. But so a lot of it is landfill, and that is, building more space for living and other things, but at the expense of the environment of those bays and those, wetlands. There's a lot of incineration. They've developed incinerators that, on paper, at least, and I tend to trust it, or don't release much in the way of harmful material, and then what's left over is sort of compacted and then stored. So it's a big problem. But there's a very interesting thing going on in the town of Kamikatsu, which is in Shikoku, which announced that it would become a zero waste city. This was about 10 years ago, and they have built an infrastructure for helping and encouraging people to have zero waste. So everything is recycled, reused. They've built some showcase buildings, which are remarkable in terms of sustainable design. They're also using recycled components from other buildings, et cetera. So there are people and communities and let's say municipalities who recognize the importance of trying to achieve zero waste and are actually trying to walk the walk while they're talking the talk.
And I guess as a sort of, between Kamikatsu and the Edo period, what happened exactly? You've presented this wonderful picture of a very self-contained system. What happened to it during Meiji and after?
Meiji period, began 1868, and the country decided it needed to adopt Western industrial technology. And one of the first things that happened was the beginning of the use of fossil fuels, of coal, as a fuel supply for industry, but then for household use. And this broke that important connection to the forest, to this notion of husbanding and protecting the forest for fuel. Now it's it's fossil fuel. We can just import more, find more in our own country. So that was a big thing. Building techniques, adopting, let's say, steel, concrete, other types of construction that don't lead to easier recycling like was done before. That was a big issue. Plus this rise in consumer society. I mean, Japan, especially the merchants, always loved novelty. It was a fairly consumer society among the merchants, but this became the entire society. And they're all, they have aspirations. It becomes an aspirational society where people do want to consume and have new things and, have a new lifestyle. So all of these things, there's a shift in values, a shift in techniques, a shift in energy, guided by government policy. And look, this was a Meiji period. The country was, bounded by Asian countries that had been colonized, sometimes in a very brutal fashion. They managed to prevent the country from becoming colonized because of their rapid industrialization. But, we're now understanding a lot of the negative effects of some of the decisions. And I will say, at the end, they also made some wise decisions. For instance, they didn't have enough funds to both make extensive road networks and railroads, and they decided that railroads were better, and consequently, the roads in Japan are so lousy, and the rail system is fabulous. So this is, they made a lot of good decisions. And this anti-waste ethic, this is continued. We still hear about the mottainai. This still exists. It may be sort of simmering, and ready to blossom again.
Great. There's a question that kind of alludes to something I was wondering about as well, and that is, could you talk a little bit about how this picture of sustainability, specifically in Edo-period Japan, differs from what you might find in many agricultural communities throughout the world, both past and present? Does it lie particularly in the systematization that you talked about, or is there something else that's unique about this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think certainly in case of East Asia, if we look at the Korean Peninsula, certainly much of China and even Southeast Asia, there are a lot of similarities. I mean, people were forced to, they had lots of incentive to economize, to conserve resources, mainly financial incentive. And that was a big thing. One of the reasons why people in Japan, the Edo-period did as well. It made sense for them financially. Japan was particularly, though, limited, being an island and then having instituted this policy of closing the country at the beginning of the Edo period, where they're no longer going to take imports. And this is a conscious economic and political decision. So they're not going to be able to supplement their resources to any large degree by imports. I mentioned the landscape, the mountainous landscape, and the lack of metals and other things, was a real issue. I think in terms of the approach, Japan was probably more literate than other Asian nations, East Asian nations at the time. And it was let's call it a warrior society, which, like ancient Rome, it led to great organizational skill and helped encourage this great communication ability, the publishing and everything else. So they had some advantages that I think, let's say, to a greater degree than other places did. And also had some particular disadvantages. So I think that's why the character is somewhat distinct. And I mentioned a month ago, I was in Germany for some interesting programs and spent time, a few days, traveling, visiting old monasteries with a landscape architect who had been restoring historical monastery gardens. And our discussion was really about the similarities, how they, certainly approached the forest, husbanding the forest, how they approached, agricultural land, how they approached water systems. There was just a lot of similarities. I mean, the actual species and forms of everything was very, very different, but the fundamental concepts were very, very similar. So this medieval Europe probably has a lot of commonalities with what we saw in Edo-period Japan.
Well, I was even thinking about some agricultural communities in the US. I mean, up until relatively recently, there were such things as barn raising parties, or re-roofing, communal re-roofing, that sort of thing. A lot of what you talked about really reminded me of things we see here.
The Amish, for instance, and
right.
some are still doing that, and that is a wonderful parallel, a perfect, almost ideal parallel to what I was describing for communal, mutual support.
So you just mentioned literacy again in your response, and there are several questions about literacy. So first, what accounted for the advanced literacy in the Edo period? Was there some sort of campaign behind it? And also, how does literacy and lifespan relate? The questioner noted that you talked about some very short lifespans among people with very high literacy.
They didn't read, they'd live longer. No, I don't think what the connection is. Although I will point out that literacy and information publishing about everything from food to water to how to make things certainly improved quality of life. And we did see over the course of centuries improving lifespan, improving material, quality of life, housing, clothing, improving hygiene, et cetera. So there were improvements. I think I want to say that probably one of the major drivers towards literacy was the desire for status. And I can't really put it another way, except that, writing was introduced from the continent, from, the Korean Peninsula and from China. Initially was fairly limited to the elites, so the governing elites and the monks, et cetera, and gradually went down through society. Samurai were pretty much required to be literate because so much of their work, it required a kind of education in morals, as well as education in history and other things they needed to know. So they were kind of encouraged to be literate, and even not required to be literate. And if you were a lower caste in that society, you could think, that, yes, I would like to learn how to read as well. And education became available. There were schools, certainly called terakoya, temple schools, that were available for commoners. Often the teachers were lower ranking samurai who basically didn't have a lot of money and they couldn't do any other jobs. So that was allowed. So I think it's the desire to improve one's lot, to understand, and to gain status somehow as a knowledgeable person, as a knowledgeable literate person. Certainly the fact that samurai were required to do it was probably a big one too.
Thank you. Could you recommend a few places in Japan where you mentioned that there are sort of Satoyama experiences now, or are there other sites in Japan that you would recommend for learning about sustainability and farmsteads?
Yeah, there are. I mentioned, for instance, the town of Kamikatsu, which now has become kind of a tourist, spot because of what they're doing. That's very interesting, I think. In almost every, region of Japan, there are towns and communities that are really putting a lot of energy into restoring old farmhouses and into doing this thing. It's almost the question would almost be like, is there one within an hour of where I'll be staying? There really are quite a few. Nagano Prefecture, sort of because of its closeness to Tokyo and the fact that it was already sort of a vacation spot, there's a lot of places in Nagano where this, like things like forest bathing, we were learning about, Satoyama, learning about, staying in old farmhouses. Many towns in Nagano where you can do that if you're visiting Tokyo, for instance. In Kyoto, in northern part of Kyoto, it was very interesting. There was something called the Kominka Summit. So the Old Farmhouse Summit earlier this year in April, right north of Kyoto in the mountains. And that region is dotted with wonderfully restored old farmhouses, a lot of them done by foreigners, which was interesting, and a lot of cultural and environmental activities as well that are related. So there's a lot. And, if someone wants to contact me later, you can share my contact information and I can, learn more about what specifically they want and they can go see it.
Thank you. There are two questions about architecture. One, you mentioned a special room that samurai had. What was that?
The zashiki. And I sort of ran out of time, but maybe I can just share that one image, the one that's on the cover of my book. So here we go. I'll just share just for a moment. There we go. So this, and initially this type of room was brought in by monks. It's a sort of a ceremonial reception room. It has the tokonoma niche and for artworks or hanging scrolls and decorative shelves, etc. And it's connected to the garden and of course the tatami mats. And the beautiful thing is this was perfected, 300 years ago at least, and people, the Japanese people, are still comfortable in this kind of room. Which just like we can sit in a chair from the 17th century and be comfortable, they can live in this way. But the zashiki was initially an elite aspect of the home, and lower ranking families were prohibited from having them. But little by little, especially as farmers became more affluent, they would be allowed to have these things as well. So it's the typical Japanese room that we see, and I'm sure there's one, if not more of them at the Shoya. And I sort of looked at the plan of the Shoya and see that there is the ornamental garden to the side, and probably there is a zashiki room that opens onto it. So yeah, this is the room, the zashiki. So when we think of a Japanese room, that's what it is.
Great. Thank you. Robert, I don't know if you're still here, but if would you want to say anything about the zashiki or the layout of the shoya? You just flashed on the screen. Oh, great. Thank you.
So there is a zashiki, which is the principal room in the shoya house. We found that the shoya house is really interesting because it's really an amalgam and almost a lexicon of Japanese building styles from the Doma area that Azby mentioned, the earthen floor, where it is in a very rustic style, Minka style, to the zashiki, which is in a formal style. The house also has a front, the public side of it, since it was the house of an administrator, and it had the private side of it. So you have all aspects of Japanese building that is incorporated in this. And one thing that we really wanted to show, there are many public gardens in the United States, but most of these are stroll gardens. And I think that the majority of Japanese gardens, as the Japanese enjoy them in Japan, are residential gardens where you sit in the zashiki and you are surrounded by a garden. And so that's one special feature that we wanted to bring to the Huntington so Americans could enjoy them.
Beautiful. And how far along is the garden now?
The garden, so we brought all the stones from the original garden, and those have been restored, and we will begin planting in January. So it's probably another 3 or 4 months to do the garden and the surround.
Great. Yeah, one aspect I was, hoping to cover more about samurai lifestyle. And one thing that was interesting was to learn that over time, samurai became impoverished, especially in Edo, in the city, and gradually were converting their beautiful gardens, ornamental gardens, into urban farms. And growing their own food, and then growing food that they could share with their relatives and their neighbors. And this meant this entire city of Edo, with hundreds of thousands of samurai households, are almost all farming, which was a scale of urban farming we didn't see again until maybe the Second World War. And in that case, it was fairly temporary. This is going on for more than a century. So it's a remarkable thing. And samurai being educated, they would generally approach it as educated people, reading the manuals. How can I grow the best pumpkin? How can I grow the best eggplant? And sort of competitive with their neighbors, for instance. So to me, it's a remarkable thing that they were samurai. And you mentioned this is, partly a farmhouse in a way. They originally were, rural people. Who were farming until they were brought into the cities and to the castles in that period. So there was a great roots in the land. And my sense was always that the garden, the view from the zashiki, the whole design is intended to give the person the sense that they're still in the mountains somewhere, in a little house in the mountains, even though they're inside the bustling city. You're muted, Phillip.
Sorry, thank you. I wanted to pose one other question about architecture. You emphasize the kind of simple structural style of a lot of pre-modern Japanese architecture. How does that intersect with earthquakes?
This is a remarkable thing. They're actually very, very resilient in earthquakes, generally. The structure is flexible. It means it can shake and then move back. The roof structure tends to be fairly heavy, so that acts as a damper. Up to a certain point, it is helping to minimize the movement because of the mass it has. If it's too much and you get out over the center of gravity, then you'll have a collapse. And of course, that happened. But these buildings were very, very robust. And I pointed to the 1,300-year pagoda at Yakushiji, and there's a similar one at Hori, and many centuries-old buildings in Japan that have survived countless earthquakes. Basically, the danger is fire. And it's interesting to me because, during my course of my studies, I was reading, early accounts by Europeans in the Meiji period. And there was an engineer who came to Japan from the UK, and he refused to believe that there were buildings 500 years old in Japan because they didn't use diagonal bracing. And how could they possibly build a structure without this Western approach? He just didn't understand how they work. And now we understand much better. It's a very, very wise approach to building.
Great. Thank you. So I think maybe I'll just pose one final question that takes us toward the future. So it appears that Edo culture was based on a more unified and, in a sense, conscientious kind of mindset. Given the overwhelming volume of information in modern society, how can we spread information about circularity and ensure that this concept really is put into practice? What's your hope for this concept?
It's hard to be optimistic. I'll be frank, right? And people like myself and colleagues, we've been talking about these issues and trying to encourage, changes for decades, really. I mean, since my university time. And little by little, people are realizing that it was really true. I mean, we have so much still ongoing denial of climate change in the U.S. U.S. is sort of an outlier for a lot of this. The rest is helping persuade people by giving examples of how this, instead of being some kind of decrease in their quality of life or their lifestyle, that it actually can be done in a way that improves the quality of life, that can be done beautifully. I mean, everything that was made in the Edo-period Japan basically was beautiful and also functioned in this way environmentally to help preserve and restore things. So I think as we have more examples of people showing, look at this great thing I have, and it happens also to be sustainable, it happens to be circular, but it's beautiful. As we are seeking status, as we are, somehow we have aspirations, as we design things and things become, more pervasive in our society that fit these models, I think it will happen. People vote with their pocketbooks, right? And they vote with their feet. So it has to be based on people preferring this sort of thing to something done another way. And at the moment, there's a real cost differential for a lot of things. But I think that will narrow over time. And in the case of Europe, again, I alluded to regulations. They are now implementing regulations across the board that are requiring, in other cases, encouraging businesses and everyone else to do things in a circular manner. So that will also have an effect. I mean, there's a role for government influence, hopefully a light touch. People then seeking their own benefit is a major motivator. And the seeking beauty, I think, is really a big one. Without beauty, it's not going to happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this talk and for your generous responses in the Q&A. Many of the attendees join me in expressing their thanks to you. And we've had multiple requests that you give another lecture and finish what you couldn't finish today. So we will have to bring you back for that.
Whether it's the carpentry, whether it's, talk more about samurais and how that might relate to the Shoya. That would be an interesting thing. So I would always be happy to come back. I hope to go there in person, before too long as well. So, and I really appreciate your invitation and hosting me. And I think the audience was great. I'm seeing the comments. I just love the thoughtfulness of the comments and questions.
Great. Well, thank you again. And thank you, Robert, for your comments about the Shoya. This was wonderful. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll hope to see you in January for Morgan Patalka's talk.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.